Okay, so first of all I should just thank you guys for inviting me. I feel as if I'm in rather illustrious company, sort of having to follow Ginny, so it's like, big shoes to follow. I don't feel quite in that league, but anyway, I can do my best. As Afu has said, my speciality is disability. I started out life as a speech and language therapist, working in the NHS. And then I went to work in India with disabled children. And then I got interested in culture and disability and broader things and decided to sort of move sideways into anthropology. So I did various bits of anthropology, including a PhD here. But I've always focused on, my original professional background was working with children, with disabled children. I just moved into that when I moved into anthropology, so it's always been a passion to think about that particular group of children. So I studied with Alison here, and that really shifted my thinking quite a long way from what it had been when I had been a professional, health professional working with children. So I'd already started to make that shift, but I think I made it even more when I studied with Alison Bain. So when I was invited to give this talk, I was given a complete open remit, so I wasn't really quite sure what to tackle. And I thought about various topics that were not about disability, but then I thought, here's my chance to convert a few people and enlighten a few people who probably know quite a lot about childhood, but maybe haven't thought about disability very much. So excuse me if any of you are experts on disability. I think probably most of you aren't. So my mission really is to give you a bit of a glimpse into that world and how the group of children who we call disabled fit into that bigger group of children, if you like. So I very much see disabled children within the context of children generally. So what I'm going to do is attempt to look at some of the trends and concepts within the arena of childhood studies in the global north and the global south. And I've got to say that I have worked a lot in India and Sri Lanka, but now I'm doing work in East Africa mainly, various projects, research projects to do with disability broadly, and particularly focusing on disabled children and disabled children's perceptions of their lives. So I want to look at some of the concepts that come up, and there is a bit of an overlap with G's, which probably is a really good thing, in terms of problematising some of the very popular notions that we have in childhood, and getting us to think in a little bit more detail about how those work if we're thinking about disabled children. So I'm going to draw on the literature, but also very broadly on 3 studies that I've done. So I'm not going to tell you about those studies in detail. Studies with disabled children in the UK, in India and Sri Lanka, and in Uganda and Malawi. So I'll use some quotes from some of those children, and I'll tell you a little about each of those studies in a second. So in the abstract, I said that I wanted to look at some of these key sort of mantras, if you like, that we get in child studies. So essentially, probably like most of you in this room, I'm interested in what children have to say, although in my case I'm particularly interested in what disabled children have to say. And this is not necessarily motivated to compare them with other children, but simply to find out about their views and how their views, disabled children's views, fit into the bigger picture, and to make sure they're in the picture, basically, because very often they're not in the picture. They have things to say, and mainly we don't hear what they have to say. They're largely absent from view, if you like. So just quickly I'll tell you about the 3 studies that I'm going to sort of dip into a little bit. So the UK study was my PhD work, which was a distributed ethnography with a group of very severely disabled teenagers here who all had little or no speech. So they're a challenge because you can't just go sit down and talk to them. So I spent a year and a half following them around, following them, finding other ways of getting to hear what they had using various different communication systems. And sure enough, they had a lot to say. It was focused mainly on identity, so it was about them and their social relationships, how they saw themselves, how they thought other people saw them, and how they negotiated their relationships with others in the context of not having speech. The studies I've done most recently in India and Sri Lanka was really a pilot, just a very small little funding for something bigger that I haven't got money for yet, which is to try and explore inclusive methodologies for doing work with disabled children. So trying out with groups of children ways that we can do group work or individual work with children with different types of disabilities, so we can hear what they have to say. It was also broadly exploring issues around poverty and issues around inclusion. So that was the hook on which to try out some methodologies. And then in Uganda and Malawi, I'm just finishing off a project which is a bigger project with disabled adults and disabled children, developing a participatory methodology for exploring the services they get in those areas, in Uganda and Malawi, mostly in rural areas. So we're developing a whole methodology for doing participatory evaluation of programmes, which has turned out to be a bit of a nightmare. I wish I'd never started it, but never mind, you do these things. So talking to children disabled children is part of that bigger study. So I'm going to draw a little bit on each of those. So overall, looking at those three studies, and I'll come back to this, despite these different settings and the different aims of those studies, what was noticeable at the bottom line, I'm going to tell you the bottom line at the beginning, just a bit, is the remarkable similarity between those children in the UK, India, Sri Lanka, Malawi and Uganda say about their lives. Lots of similarities. So that kind of breaks down this north-south thing to some extent. Despite very different cultural contexts and huge differences in availability of resources, there are lots of commonalities between those probably 100 or so disabled children in different places. Okay, so basically my work is somewhere in the middle of those three interlocking circles. So I draw on childhood studies, I draw on disability studies, which a bit like childhood studies is a fairly new arena of knowledge that draws on different disciplines, and international development academia, which is also a bit of a mishmash of different disciplinary backgrounds. So just to set the scene a little bit, I don't want to bore you all with lots of figures, but because to a large extent they may be a bit meaningless, but I suppose we could just think a little bit about how many disabled children there are roughly in the world. And we think there are about 150 million disabled children. Depends how you count them, who you count, etc. UNICEF think there are about 93 million disabled children with moderate to severe difficulties under the age of 14. So they're a large group. That's probably an underestimate. And as I say, in some ways the figure is showing you the figure is a bit pointless, but at the same time it's also there's big figures. However, what's important is that large group of children are to a large extent an invisible group, wherever they are. Many disabled children are not counted, they're not registered in any kind of way, and they remain hidden in their communities, or sometimes even hidden in their families. And we know very broadly that on the whole they live in relative disadvantage compared with their non-disabled peers. So they have relatively poor access to all the things that we expect other children to have. So they have poor access to health, poor access to education, they have increased levels of neglect and abuse, etc., etc., etc. So they're a group that we've kind of left out of the picture. More dramatically than those figures about health access, we know that that they're often excluded, bullied, abused, neglected. So for instance, the rates of sexual abuse of disabled children is roughly 4 times the rate of non-disabled children, and that's a very, very consistent finding all over the world, in the global north and the global south, 4 times the rate. So if we think about disabled children's role and place in society, whether we're in the north or the south, they're clearly a member of 2 structural groups in society, children and disabled, both of whom are often cast as burdensome or as vulnerable or as helpless or as receivers rather than contributors to society. So once you're labelled as a disabled child, you can easily get a bit stuck. So thus they're at risk of and often experience structurally violent types of experiences. So we've had quite a lot of discussion already today about binaries, and I put in a bit about that. So I just thought if we use the term disabled children from the global south, then we've immediately got the binary of adult versus child, we've got north versus south, we've got non-disabled versus disabled, or we might have normal and abnormal possibly. And all of those are contested terms that are fuzzy and difficult and in some ways don't really help the situation. So these days, disability is mainly seen as a social, political and relational situation for somebody, as well as the biology, of course. It's not really seen in that medical way. There's been a big move away from medical approaches to disability, which I won't dissect further here. But in the global north, you probably know that disability activists have lobbied hard over the last 20 or 30 years using the social model of disability, which basically shifts the emphasis away from the individual to society and to what society does in response to somebody who's different. So the social model of disability puts the onus on society to do something different. It doesn't put the onus on the individual to change. So the social model of disability is one of those theories, models that has been wholeheartedly exported to the global south, picked up and used in a variety of different ways, sometimes pretty much as it was evolved here, sometimes changed and adapted. And that social model has achieved, at a political and social level, it has achieved some quite important changes in terms of attitudes and policies for disabled people, including the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which was passed in 2007. So the social model is an important thing for thinking about disability in the global north and also in the global south. And also the rhetoric around rights is also very widespread. In context of poverty in the global south, people's most pressing concerns, if they have a disabled member of their family, are things like access to resources, to secure livelihoods, to health, education, justice, rehabilitation. Some of those kinds of things are very difficult to get into access. They're very scarce, some of those resources. And also, there's a difficulty around being recognised as an equal citizen, as being a rights bearer at all in many circumstances. Okay, so what I want to do now is look at a number of different concepts and terms. And the first one is something that's come up already, which is developmental approaches to children and childhood, and what effect they might have for disabled children. So we can see that there's a strong trend globally towards developmental approaches in policies and programming. So the early child development movement, if you like, is a big movement, lots of activity, lots of donor funding, lots of NGO activity, lots of programs being rolled out to provide input of various sorts to young children. Lots of developmental testing of children and discussion about different surveillance methods for looking at children's development. And that's really being sort of globalised. Lots of discussion about whether you can have one standard type of child development assessment. So these ECD programmes assume that there's a uniformity of development in children, privileging biology over a social view. And the aim seems to be to separate those conforming with standard developmental progress from those who don't. So this leads to some very categorical thinking about children. So, and I think that disabled children are the losers in this game. So if you're going to aim to developmentally assess every child in the country or in the state or the district or whatever, then you're basically doing some sort of assessment, tick box exercise where you decide which children have passed the developmental test and which haven't. So children are being categorised and dichotomised through this developmental testing. And I ask myself, who benefits from this? This focus on early child development is clearly linked to some good things that have happened in terms of health. So I work in a health department, so I suppose I have a bit of a health hat on. So we've got much improved infant and child mortality rates. So in almost every country of the world, a few exceptions. And of course that's great, children are living rather than dying. So once children are surviving, the next logical step maybe is to think about them thriving, to think about them growing and learning. So that all seems very nice and logical, they're alive, so what's going to happen to them next? So with increasing school attendance, you get some interest in getting children ready for school. So this elusive and puzzling term, well, it's elusive and puzzling to me, school readiness. What does that actually mean? So there's lots of push now to get children ready for school, whatever that is. And it seems to be getting more and more pressurised, that pressure on parents to get their children school ready. But what happens if you've got a disabled child who's failed the developmental screening process? There's a worrying emphasis on conforming to some sort of normal ideal about what that child should be like, represented by the mighty developmental milestones which are checked by these international manuals and exported here and there and everywhere. So what does all this testing, how does this testing leave disabled children? So the curious thing to me is that if a child is identified as not conforming to the, or not performing to the developmental progress, then that's failing the test. But nothing much then happens. It seems to be that if you pass the test, you skip off over the horizon and go into school readiness, and it's all marvellous. But if you have a child that doesn't pass the test, nothing much happens. You're just given a bit of a sort of rubber stamp of failure. There aren't any resources to change that situation or to think of accepting that child as being different. Quite often a label is then put on that child in a way that I think is quite devastating, but without any kind of support or help for the parents about having a child who's different in some kind of way. So there's a child who probably does need support to enter the education system, and also support to be part of society. They very easily become rejected. So I would ask whether the ECD system actually reinforces one type of child as being okay and desirable. The child who's okay and desirable is the one who hits the milestones. So this brings us on to the idea of normal and abnormal categorising. So we might want to ask, well, what is normal? Normal for who? Normal for where? What kind of child are you supposed to be normal? And what's this label that you get if you're not normal? So sometimes failing the developmental test brings a naming and categorising of the child that is new for the family. Maybe they didn't know that their child was going to fall into this category. So suddenly difference is kind of thrust upon them, if you like, difference and possibly the word disability or a local version of that word. It's brought into being through the naming of it. So once this naming has happened, it's a reified kind of label. All sorts of consequences come once your child has failed the test and your child has been told they've got Down syndrome or cerebral palsy or blindness or whatever it is. There are consequences for the individual and there are consequences for the family who have a child with that kind of, who's in that kind of category. But what's interesting is if you ask, so suddenly the child is abnormal and maybe also the family are abnormal. There's some discussion about that in the literature about whether if you have a disabled child in your family, if you have an abnormal child in your family, are you an abnormal family? I just want to smack whoever writes that. But anyway, it's sort of, the whole family get pathologised as well as the child. If you ask families who have disabled children whether their child is normal or whether they're a normal family, they say we're a normal family. That's what they generally say. So they have a normal that is different from some other people's normal, but it's normal to them. So they recalibrate how they feel about that child. They have the child before they knew the child was going to be categorised in this way. They're already in love with the child. He's part of their social relations within their family. And so they see the child as a normal child. And that's because the child is a social being within the household, irrespective of whether he can walk or see or talk or whatever it might be. So the parents, and I think this is true in the bits of research I've done show that this is true in the global north and the global south, if we're going to use those terms. Parents everywhere see themselves as having a normal family, even if they have a child who's different in some kind of way. So the rhetoric about ECD programming is that children should be helped to achieve their potential, whatever that is. And this is underpinned by strong neoliberal ideas about children's worth as an investment, as a potential contributor in the future. So embedded in the privileging of academic progress are ideas about the types of work that children might do later, their worth and their status, anticipating future lives as individuals who will have the right kind of work. So if you're a disabled child, it may be that the parents will already see into the future that that's perhaps going to be difficult. So it's potentially pathologising and rejecting and othering of that child at a very early stage. it's reinforcing the idea of them as people who need fixing, and it sort of assumes that biology is more important than social and contextual relational aspects of the person. So once the child is identified as disabled, then these other bits of the category start to develop. For instance, being seen as vulnerable, being seen as incompetent, being as an eternal child, never growing up, being seen as an asexual person. All of these things have been written about in the disability literature. Okay, so in my book, very pure obsessive developmental approaches are without any surrounding support for children who don't pass those assessments are quite damaging. Okay, so just thinking about as children get a bit older, so arguably younger children have little control over this process of labelling and categorising. It's kind of imposed upon them early, and then it has these long-term life-changing consequences. For instance, in relation to choices of school, whether they can go to community activities, who they play with, and later on who they can marry, or if they can marry, that kind of thing. But as they get a bit older, what I've observed is that they gradually learn to resist some of this, and they start to subvert those kind of identities and their exclusion if they can. But this can be a really uphill battle. They try and find ways of, so once they know that they've been given this category, they try and find ways around it. But I think it's very dependent on the responses of the immediate family and the community. And that'll make a big difference about whether they are able to resist it and forge a positive identity. We can see that as children become young adults, they discover ways that they discover the ways that they're perceived, and they construct their own underlying identity as a disabled person, or maybe they reject that label. They often have to challenge infantilizing ideas about them being treated, older children being treated as much younger, or adults with disabilities being treated as younger. And they're often excluded from particular places or particular activities. And they may be patronised by being given too much help and too much protection, more than they want. One girl in one of my studies said to me, "I want just enough help, not too much. If you give me too much, it's just annoying. I want to be." She knew exactly how much help she needed with this or that thing, and she didn't. She got really cross if she was given too much. So patronised by too much help, or left vulnerable when not given enough help and at real risk. Okay, so some popular concepts, some of which have come up already, that I want to just kind of explore a little bit. What time should I start?
3:30.
Okay. 4:30 stuff.
3:30 started.
Oh, so what time?
Okay. I'll tell you.
Okay. Just have to wait for me. Shut up. Okay. So popular concepts that I think are interesting when it comes to disability are these: participation and inclusion, agency, which we've had already, and vulnerability. So what do they mean for these kinds of people? So thinking about inclusion, which I think is a kind of a new orthodoxy, it's kind of everywhere, isn't it? And in fact, it's in the new SDGs that have come out. So I checked yesterday, because I knew that it was dotted all over the place. It's mentioned in 5 of the 17 headline goals of the SDGs, education, infrastructure, and a couple of others, as a term. And it's linked to the mantra of leave no one behind, and refers to a number of different people. Obviously, it doesn't just refer to disabled people, it refers to a number of different excluded groups, so orphans, ethnic or religious minorities, migrants, street children, all sorts of people would come into that excluded bunch of people. Disabled people are quite a big group when it comes to that. Bless you. So what do people think inclusion means? How do people envisage inclusion happening? Is it achievable? What needs to happen to achieve inclusion? If it means everyone gets to join in on an equal footing, then how's that going to work exactly? Certainly with disabled children or disabled people, we're nowhere near it yet, anywhere in the world. There are some places that are better than others, and actually the UK is doing quite well. It's held up as a bit of a model for inclusive practice, even though if you ask disabled people or disabled parents, they know quite a lot about it. It's actually, other countries, we're doing quite well. Often the main focus of inclusion talk tends to be on education. So inclusive education is something that's often focused on. But of course, inclusion doesn't just mean within schools. Inclusive education means all children going to the same school, but it actually means inclusion more generally means a bigger thing. It means an inclusive society, it means inclusive healthcare, inclusive leisure and arts, inclusive justice system, so that everything is accessible to everybody, and that's a much bigger deal than having all the children in the same school. So perhaps we need to look at the blocks and barriers to this, and it seems to me that if you drill down and think what the blocks are, they're mainly about attitude to difference. So it's something about how people respond to difference. So way back in the childhood studies literature, Chris Jenks once said that children, talked about children as being either dangerous or in danger. And I thought that's so much more true of disabled children. They're either dangerous, they're kind of scary, liminal people, or they're in danger because they're very vulnerable. They seem to be a scary bunch, and they seem to find it difficult to get into the centre of things. They're always on the margins. So one of the children in my UK study, who was a very disabled boy who couldn't move much of himself at all, said that one of the things that I was asking him about what he was good at, and he was good at quite a lot of things. He said one of them was at observing. He was very good at observing people, and he said this was because he spent so much time doing it. So basically, he spent most of his time sitting, watching what's going on. So he's made a virtue out of a necessity that no one ever gets him really included. So he sits and watches very carefully and analyses everything that's going on. So he described himself as a very good social observer. And he recognised that he was on the edge looking in at things, but not really being included. And he kind of sort of accepted that, but he would really like to have been in the middle of it. Okay. So this is one of the boys in India that I talked to, who's got a muscular condition where he's gradually lost his ability to walk. So he used to go to school, but now he can't go to school because he can't walk, and there's no way of getting him there. Bright boy, sitting at home, missing not going to school, becoming invisible in that village, basically. Okay, so I had a go at trying to think about how we deal with difference in our heads. I mean, meet someone who's very different. I'm not sure if this works, but anyway, I just thought I'd have a go at it. Okay, so we've got a bit of a range of different ways that we might respond when we meet somebody very different from us. So we might feel discomfort. We might think, oh, they're very different from me. I'm not quite sure about them. I'm going to be embarrassed if I have to talk to them. Don't quite know what they're going to think of me. But then, so that's sort of more towards excluding them, because you might then avoid talking to them, or kind of change the subject or cross the road or whatever. So slightly better than that would be tolerating them. So thinking, well, it's hard work and I feel a bit embarrassed, but I'll have a go. Or better than that, maybe you're very kind of enlightened and positive, and you think it's okay for people to be different. I'm interested in accepting of that person, and I can see that they have something to contribute, so that's a more inclusive approach. And then at the far end, up in the disability rights movement, you've got celebration of disability, celebration of diversity. You probably know that in the autistic community, there's a celebration of neurodiversity. Isn't it wonderful to have such wacky thoughts, all that kind of stuff? So that's up at the celebration. But I think there's a kind of sliding scale, and we can often see this working when we see people's response to somebody. So, because I'm quite interested in personhood, I think we can sort of map that on to what's happening to that person's personhood, their status as a person. So, if you're only tolerating the person, it's kind of conditional. Okay, well, you're a bit strange, but all right, I'll kind of put up with it. It's only a very conditional kind of personhood. Whereas at this end, we've got something that's promoting different types of personhood, and at the other end, we've obviously got denying personhood. And I think historically, and in some parts of the world, disabled people are usually experiencing that kind of negativity, that they're denying personhood everything. So we've got revulsion at one end, and we've got positive recognition at the other end, and then we've got sort of curiosity in the middle. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with this, but I'm kind of like playing around with it. Okay, so inclusion. Sorry, just a little bit more about that. Inclusion has moved on. globally, people thinking about inclusion and trying to make places more accessible and trying to get people involved in things, but quite often it's remained at the level of physical inclusion, so putting in some ramps or some bars. People don't think about the inclusion of people with unusual behaviour or who communicate in different ways. That's or people with mental health issues, that's much more difficult. So physical inclusion is making progress, but inclusion of what you might call the more difficult people or the more different people is much more challenging. And somebody called Carol Thomas, who's quite a well-known disability researcher, has called this more subtle kind of discrimination psycho-emotional disableism. So disableism, very kind of overt disableism, where you say, no, you can't come in here because you're in a wheelchair, that's kind of disappearing. Even in the global south, where in very rural areas where there's not much in the way of resources and concrete to make ramps or whatever, people understand that somebody who's in a wheelchair should be able to get into the hospital. But somebody who's got more subtle difficulties or is more challengingly strange, if you like, still suffers from psycho-emotional disorders. In other words, subtly excluding them, and that's still going. And that's much more difficult to legislate against. Okay, I'm going to skip a bit of stuff, I think. Okay, so the next one that I thought was interesting is participation, and again, that's very sort of current within within childhood studies. We talk a lot about the nature of participation. There are people in this room who've written about this and know much more about it than me. But basically sort of critiquing what kind of participation is real. Does participatory research have to be at the top of the pile? We're still not sure what it really means. We're still not sure whether it is always a good thing or how it can be achieved, or even what it looks like sometimes. But some people have problematised it, said that not all research with children has to be participatory in relation to working children or in relation to research. But we might want to, I think we might want to widen the meaning of participation if we're thinking about disability. We need to think hard about how we can actually include disabled children in a participatory kind of way. So this is what I've been trying to do in various places. And my experience is that disabled children do want to participate, like the boy sitting on the edge. They want to participate, but they may have to do this, or they may want to do it in a very different way from your classic, the children are all joining in kind of style. They may not necessarily think that joining in means doing or saying anything. It may be being present that is participating for them, or it may even just be being invited would be nice, rather than being absent from community life. So we need to deconstruct participation and think about it in a bit more detail. It's a bit of a vicious circle. If you're not visible, so if you never go out of your house, then you're not thought of. So then when someone's doing some nice project in the village, you're not anywhere visible, so you don't get invited, so you're made unknown, so you're invisible, so it goes round. So the problem is that you're already in an oppressed kind of position, and you're not able to demonstrate anything different because you don't join in. And so it's hard for you to get into school, it's hard for you to go to the village cricket club, you don't get invited to the weddings, or, okay, 10 minutes, yeah. Okay, so participation is really tricky. We need to think much more carefully about how disabled children might participate in ways that look a bit different from other children. Okay, so this is one of my participants from my PhD who had no speech, but he had an awful lot of things to say. And he said this one day, using his communication aid. He did an awful lot of talking with his eyes and with his symbol board and things like that. He told me a lot of things using non-speech kind of methods. So I think that if we rely too much on what we might think of as the sort of standard participatory methods, of using stories or using drama or those kinds of things, if we rely too heavily on verbal language, then some children are just going to be excluded. The use of non-verbal and visual materials has been discussed quite a lot, the pros and cons of that. We're using pictures or photos and that kind of thing. And people talk quite a lot about whether that makes it more fun, which it probably does. But for these children, it's not just about it being more fun, it's actually a way for them to communicate. If you don't have those pictures, then they can't understand what you're talking about, possibly, if they're deaf, or if they've got learning difficulties, or they can't say anything because they need to point to a picture to tell you what they mean. So having pictures and symbols is not just a fun thing, it's an essential thing for communication for these children. So quite often I think methods of inclusive or participatory research can be a bit tokenistic. They don't really think quite enough about exactly how some different types of children are going to participate. So Carol Thomas, who I mentioned earlier, talks quite a lot about the difference between being and doing. And she said that disabled people often may not be able to do anything very much, but their being is important. And if there isn't any recognition of the importance of being, then you're going to be excluded quite a lot. If our measures of importance about who you are as a citizen are through your type of participation, if you're not an active participator, then you can't win. You're just, if it's all about being an active participator, about being economically productive, for instance, and you're not going to be economically productive, then you're stuck, basically. And you can't measure up in the right kind of way. So we often say that children shouldn't be regarded as homogeneous. We need to recognise diversity. But I think we need to take this much, much further in terms of what kinds of diversity and what types of participation are actually recognised. Okay, just for some gurus. So Tom Shakespeare, some of you might know, is quite a key researcher in disability, and he and some colleagues a long time ago did some research about children in the UK. It was one of the first studies with disabled children. I think it makes a good point here. And there's an awful lot of that going on, asking the parents or the professionals or the teachers about disabled children's views, asking proxies, not asking children again. People find it a bit too scary and difficult to ask disabled children themselves, so they become more and more invisible. Okay, I was going to talk about agency, but I think I'll skip that actually, because I'm running out of time. So that's going to be my agency, blah blah blah, which I think I'll just skip that one. And I was also going to talk a bit about vulnerability, because I think vulnerability is something that is... No?
So don't skip it.
No?
Don't skip agency.
Just when you want to keep about agency. And you want the agency stuff?
Yeah.
Real bad. I don't think I have any answers. Okay, so agency is obviously much vaunted in childhood studies. And it's now kind of axiomatic to emphasise that children have agency, as we've already said today. And therefore they're active in their construction of themselves. But I think that as childhood studies maybe ventures forth into the global south more, perhaps, different types of agency need to be recognised. So children living different types of lives and expressing their agency in different types of ways have got to be recognised. We've got to see, when I was doing my PhD work, I got to understand that these very disabled children had ways of subverting things. They had ways of being naughty that you didn't know about until you knew them quite well. So for the first few months I didn't understand, and once I spent a lot of time I understood that they really could be quite subversive in lots of ways. But you have to understand how that works, and you have to understand that they can express choice and power, but it's in ways that you wouldn't easily see. So it's a different kind of agency. It's got to be expressed in different ways by them, because they have sometimes limited ways of doing that. So I wonder whether we're a bit too conventional and unimaginative in the way that we think about and expect agency to be claimed and enacted. We see it in rather conventional kinds of terms. Again, back to Carol Thomas and her being and doing. She would say that people, when they look as if they're not doing very much, can actually be expressing agency in particular kind of ways. So two disability researchers, Albrecht and Devlever, talked a long time ago about the apparent paradox that disabled people, if you ask disabled people about their lives, they will report having very good and excellent or excellent quality of life in circumstances when most external observers would be thinking that looks like a pretty undesirable life to me. So they're commenting on the fact that non-disabled people find it very difficult to put themselves imaginatively into the space of somebody different. So we tend to make these judgments about normal, abnormal, because we can't really imagine that different kind of life. So disabled children, I think, in terms of agency, are very often heavily reliant on their parents to help them with that process of negotiating agency, because there are so many negative things that they've got to sort of battle against and resist. So they had to learn quite a lot about how to present themselves to subvert some of that negative response that they get. They have to find ways to negotiate being respected and being recognised, and they often have to recruit extra support from parents in order to do that. For them, if there's a tendency for people to patronise or infantilise, then they have to find a way to subvert that, and sometimes they have to get their parents involved in helping everyone to know that they are a proper human being. As one of the children in Uganda said, "I want to be someone who can be someone." Yeah, she felt strongly that she could do that, but she needed to harness some help from others around her in order to be recognised as someone who could be someone. Okay, I am going to skip through a bit, I think. These are all pictures of groups of disabled children in various places having discussion. These guys on this side were having a discussion around a sort of vignette, a picture of a boy who had been excluded, who wasn't allowed to play cricket with the rest of the crew in her village. These are 7 to 9-year-olds. I'm a bit like, I think it was somebody said this morning that adults think that children can't do things, and the teacher of these children, when I told her what I was going to do, I was going to give these scenarios to these children, she said, no, they won't be able to do that. They don't know that stuff. We had a massive conversation about that, they came up with 10 or 12 solutions about this boy, one of which included, I will go to his house, I will go to the back door, and I will carry him to the cricket match on my back. And what is his mother doing? Why doesn't she let him go? So, they have a lot to say, and these are all kids with learning disabilities. Okay, so just to finish off, some key themes that came across the studies, these different places. So I found these kinds of things in all these places. Family being important, the importance of being seen as a person and not being left out, being treated equally. They all had a strong sense of fairness and unfairness, and they reported bullying. They told me about bullying. They had a strong sense of wanting friends, wanting more friends, not just friends with disabled kids, but friends with lots of different people. Enjoying material things, talked about going out to parties, having the right clothes, being fashionable, having the right haircut, going to festivals, weddings, just like other kids. Looking into the future, wanting to work and contribute financially, and that was both in the UK kids and in the Asian kids and the African kids, wanting to contribute to things going on in the house, doing housework, the garden, whatever. Wanting to go to school if they weren't at school, or to training, being proud of what they could do, and being ambitious. So, to quote the Ugandan girl again, being treated as somebody who can be something. Okay, they also had a number of things to say about their disabilities or impairment, so very specific about what they needed in relation to those things. They needed the aids and appliances, they needed people not to tease them, they needed to be in school and not left out, and they needed particular types of help. Okay, oh, that's my last page. I've got my last page now. There we go. Disabled children being included in research. It's not happening very well, it's a slow trickle. So this is in the UK, Rabi is someone who works at York, and York University have done quite a lot of work on asking disabled children about things to do with services. So some good work there. But I would extend what she says to a more global context, that if we exclude disabled children, it's usually because we don't know how to do research. It's not the disabled children's fault, it's the adults' fault if they haven't thought how to do it. There are some examples in the Global South, obviously my work and somebody called Kembabi Tan. Leonard Cheshire, the big INGO, have done some nice work with doing videos with children. Plan have started working in disability, although they're a mainstream organisation. They've done some nice videos with disabled children talking about what they want. Judith Enyu, in this book about key thinkers in childhood studies, says, as part of her interview in that book, that she flags up that she thinks there should be more research in disability. I was glad to see that somebody in that book had said that, so that's good. Okay, I'm going to So in summary, I'm going to leave it with the disabled children to say, this is what they think. They think that they have more in common with their non-disabled peers than they have differences. They want to be seen as part of the gang, really, of children generally. They don't want to be categorised separately. They want to be included, they want to participate, and they probably don't want to be seen as vulnerable. I didn't really unpick the vulnerability bit, but they don't like the term vulnerable. They see that as related to being weak and pitiable and charitable and needing charity. They want to be seen as strong and capable, just as other children do. So at the beginning I asked this question about whether disabled children should be one group or several, and I think adults often think they should be several groups, but children themselves think they should be one group. Okay. And thanks to all the children and others who helped with those two projects. Sorry, I went over.
Thanks.